So, what do you want to ask?
Okay, so what is the specific lab that you work at, or like what specific lab are you currently working on, and like what got you interested in ocean acidification?
So the sort of official, unofficial name of our lab is the Coastal Ocean Acidification Lab. It actually, ironically, spells coal, if you shorten it. A lot of things in science, it's not straightforward. It's not like somebody goes, I'm going to do this one day, and just goes and does it. We kind of came to looking at coastal ocean acidification through my boss, Whitman Miller, wanted to do, it was starting to emerge among scientists that there was this problem happening. And what they were basically seeing, to some degree, was out in the West Coast, where they grow oysters for profit, obviously. The larvae were not surviving. They were having these crashes of larvae. We decided to study larvae and CO2 enrichment in water. And thought, okay, well, that shouldn't be too hard to do. First mistake. And we're biologists, so we're sort of, you know, more on the wholesale ecology versus drilling down to the chemistry. So we had to learn the chemistry basically on the fly. So it took a while to do that, but we were able to create an experiment where we exposed Chrysostrea virginica, which is the eastern oyster, and actually they were studying for a while Erikensis, which is a relative, it's Chrysostrea erikensis, and that is a relative to virginica, but it's from Asia. It's the Asian oyster. There was this whole debate a few years ago about whether they should actually introduce Erikensis into the bay. And so we studied those two larval species, actually, and we exposed them to different levels of CO2, basically from pre-industrial age, so you're talking about before 1850, where the atmospheric levels were around 250, and then we were projecting out 100 years from now, where the atmospheric levels of CO2 in the air were about 800. And we found that the larvae grew slower under high CO2 conditions than low CO2 conditions. And so that sort of was our start of getting involved. And along the way, we realized that not a lot of stuff was actually being studied in the estuaries in regards to CO2 enrichment. Whereas the open oceans, people had been much more proactive in studying that environment. We realized that there wasn't as much known about the estuary environment. And so we started to turn our attention to actually looking at the estuary environment in CO2 versus open ocean.
Okay. So when you did that, when you looked at the CO2 in the atmosphere, so you didn't have, because you looked back a long while. So you guys did that? Did you guys look through like the ice and how much CO2 was in it?
We didn't personally, no. And so what we did is we took studies that said, you know, that through ice cores and stuff like that, that had looked to see what the atmosphere was of you know, the world.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of years ago.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
We were wondering how they would figure out what the CO2 concentration of the water was all the way back then, which makes sense. You can kind of figure it out.
You can figure it out. So yeah, so that's why scientists go up to like the polar regions and take ice cores, and that the air from, you know, sort of prehistoric air is trapped in there, and they can measure what's in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how, like, when you were studying in the estuaries, did you see like any other organisms like crabs or anything that were being affected by the ocean acidification?
So I'm going to back up a step and kind of
Oh, she is our old one. Deal with it.
Yeah,
No
well,
questions.
yeah, I mean, I'll just, you know, you can just read them to me. I don't really, you know, unless you feel like I need a guide. I can just rip at you. So, I'm going to say that you can't just look at an animal in the water and be like, well, clearly that's affected by this. There's too many variables. And if you are looking at ocean acidification and coastal ocean acidification, they're actually driven differently. So what do you guys know about ocean acidification? And then I'll kind of, so, you know, what have you guys learned about, like, what it is and stuff like that so far? Do you have some
Yeah.
basis, or?
We learned that the CO2 that's like usually produced from like big factories and stuff, when it settles in the water, it makes carbonic acid, which dissolves the calcium in the shells.
Okay, so basically that factories and cars are emitting lots of CO2, right? The CO2 is absorbed, about 30% is absorbed into the ocean, right? And so that 30%, it actually goes to carbonic acid, but it actually does something else. It actually doesn't stay as carbonic acid.
It's a weak bond, right?
Yeah, it disassociates, essentially. And basically what you're doing is it reacts with water, disassociates, just a lot of hydrogens are then floating around in the water. That's actually, that's what pH probes measure, is the amount of hydrogen floating around. And what happens is that it makes it harder for animals to, it doesn't just dissolve the shells entirely, it actually makes it harder for them to get the calcium carbonate they need to build the shells. So there's a little bit of a technical difference. I don't think you need to necessarily go into that, but it actually makes it harder for them to build the shells. So it ends up favoring bicarbonate over carbonate. And animals need carbonate and calcium to make calcium carbonate to build their shells, right?
Yeah.
But if you have bicarbonate, more bicarbonate in your water, it can't bind to that calcium, and so it becomes, that calcium carbonate becomes less bioavailable.
Yes.
And I have actually an easy graph. I can print it out for you or send it to you, actually, a couple of schematics that can kind of break down the chemistry, because it can get a little complicated. That can break down the chemistry, and maybe that would be helpful. So with the oceans, you have the atmosphere, and you have the open water, right? And all that atmospheric CO2, the 30% is getting absorbed. And that's all you have. That's the only thing that's interacting, right, together. So what you see in the open ocean environment, basically the CO2 in the ocean mirrors what's in the atmosphere. So you got about 400 in the atmosphere, you've got 400 in the ocean. In the estuary, it's way more complicated. And this is why it makes it's not just like what's happening with the factories and stuff and going into the water is actually the main driver. You have runoff of nutrients from the land. You have a benthic community that is respiring, so it's actually producing CO2 naturally and stuff like that. You have the atmospheric CO2. You have the ocean and the rivers colliding, and that creates a whole different mixing environment. So you also have plants, phytoplankton, that really affect the CO2 levels in the water. And so what you see is that you see in the open ocean that CO2 is basically classically driven. You could think of as we put more CO2 in the atmosphere and it goes into the water, that's what's going to happen. In the estuaries,
it's a little different. So like
it's
in
way
the
more
ocean,
complicated.
In the ocean, it's a little bit less factors applying.
Yes, because you have a huge body of water and you have basically one interface. And in an estuary, you have multiple interfaces.
Because everyone's living so much closer to it.
Yes, exactly. So it's not so much Well, that, the CO2 levels in the estuary are affected. We like to say in the open ocean, the chemistry drives the biology, and the estuaries, the biology actually drives the chemistry. So if you have a phytoplankton bloom, they're going to suck all that CO2 out of the water, and the pH is going to skyrocket, which we've measured. And then when that phytoplankton bloom dies, the pH plummets because they're all decaying. Yeah. So you've waded into a actually more complicated topic. I don't know if that answered your question. So I guess the long story is you just can't say you can't just look at an animal and be like. We've done a little bit of studies on crabs. They don't seem to be that affected by CO2 differences, but it also might mean because they actually live in an environment where they're going to see swings of CO2 and thus pH every day.
So they're pretty adaptable.
So yeah, so there's going to be some animals here we think that will be more adapted to swings of CO2 or thus pH.
Especially because we have such wide temperature range. Like on the West Coast, temperatures stay mostly the same temperature.
Yeah, it's a much more open ocean environment on the West. Now that's not to say that oysters, certainly on the West Coast and things like that, are being affected. They are. And they've mitigated a lot of the if you're talking specifically about oysters, a lot of the oyster hatcheries out there have, they only take up, they are starting to measure the pH of the water, and they only take up seawater during certain times in the tidal cycle. So that enables them to get less CO2 enriched water, for example, because they have what's called, we don't have this because we're in a very shallow bay, they have what's called upwelling. So they have this, this upwelling phenomenon that brings up very acidic water. And so they try to avoid the upwelling events and take up water that's conducive to growing larvae.
What efforts are currently underway to lessen the impact of ocean acidification?
Well, the only way to lessen the impacts of ocean acidification, in my mind, is to actually have real legislation that tackles the issue of CO2 and climate change. Yeah, that's the only way you're going to do it. Because ocean acidification, it is one of the effects of what we're doing, right? It's not actually a cause. Now, you can work locally, you can work, like I said, the hatcheries that are now monitoring their pH levels and they bring in water at certain times. They may try to strip the water of CO2, so you can bubble in CO2-free air, essentially, and that'll help drive off some of that CO2 and maybe raise the pH a bit. Here, I think because the biology is really driving the chemistry. If you think about, what's the practical application? What can we do today? Just monitor how much stuff you're putting in the bay, right? If phytoplankton is a driving force of large swings of CO2, try not to, fertilize your lawns as much, or fertilize at certain times to mitigate, build marshes and stuff to mitigate that kind of runoff. So you can do stuff that really is more about almost like pollution control, rather than, it's very hard to get CO2 out of the atmosphere once it's there, basically.
You can only reduce it. You can only reduce it as much as
Yeah.
So I think
once it's up there, you can plant some trees,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, so that's is it FOMRA? We looked at FOMRA.
Yeah,
The FOMRA Act for NOAA.
Oh, I haven't actually. So tell me about that.
So I think the act was made to start